She was 19 years old, and she was cast out with the first snow already in the air, and on the morning this story begins, she spent 3 of her last $4 on a wrecked riverboat that had sat rotting on a river island for 40 years. Because winter was coming, and she had nowhere in the world to go. And a wreck with a roof is still a roof. Her name was Sigrid Holm, and the thing she bought was the old sternwheeler Norland, beached high and dry on Cottonwood Island in the upper Mississippi. A gray, weathered hulk that every soul in the river town of Vesterheim, Minnesota, had grown up seeing across the water, and that no one had set foot on in a generation, because everyone knew the Norland was a dead boat, stripped long ago of anything worth carrying off, a landmark and a roost for herons and nothing more. But the Norland was not a dead boat. She was a locked one. And the lock was a thing that no one in 40 years had noticed, because it was a lock that only a boatwright's eye would ever recognize, and the last boatwright of Vesterheim was 40 years dead. The lock was tar, deep in the hull of the Norland, below the waterline that no water had touched in 40 years. Every seam and joint of the lower hold had been paid over with tar, thick and careful and complete, a sealing such as no boat ever needed and no repair ever made. And it had been done from the inside. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Sigrid Holm and the wreck of the Norland, and the hold that was tarred, shut from within. And if a story of a hard winter and a faithful secret is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what part of this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. To understand the Norland, you have to understand the town of Vesterheim, and the people who built it, and the man who built the boat. Vesterheim had been settled 2 generations back by immigrant families off the boats from the old country, Norwegians and Danes and Swedes, who had come up the great river with everything they owned in trunks, and they had built their town on the bluffs and broken the land behind it. And they had done it the way such settlements did it in those days, together through an association. The Vesterheim Settlement Association it was called, and it was the heart of the young community. Every family paid in what it could, and the association's common fund bought the land and the seed and the tools, and stood surety for the newcomers, and held the savings of families who trusted no distant bank, and it was the ark of the whole colony's hope, the pooled sweat of 100 families who had crossed an ocean on a promise. And the treasurer of the association, the man the whole colony trusted with its ark, was a boatwright named Lars Holm. He was Sigrid's great-grandfather. He had been a shipwright's apprentice in Norway before he came over, and on the river he had become a builder and master of steamboats, and he had built the Norland with his own hands, the finest boat of her size on that stretch of the river, and he had run her as a packet between the river towns, and he had been, besides, the steadiest and most trusted man in Vesterheim, which is why the association's strongboxes were kept in his charge, and its books in his hand. And then had come the year of the swindle, and everything the colony had was very nearly lost, and the saving of it was the making of the mystery that Sigrid Holm would solve 40 years later with $3 and a hard winter. There had come to that country, in the association's 10th year, a land agent named Marcus Pryor, a smooth and lettered man with connections in the state capital, and he had found, or manufactured, a flaw in the colony's land titles, a defect in the old filings, and he had brought suit to void the settlers' claims to the very land they had broken and built upon, meaning to force them to buy their own farms a second time, from him, or lose them. He had chosen his prey the way such men always chose it, a colony of foreigners as the courts of that day would see them, whose English was uncertain, whose papers had been filed in the confusion of arrival, whose grandfather's marks stood where signatures should be, and who could be counted on to be frightened of the law rather than fluent in it. Pryor came among them smiling, first offering to cure the defects he himself had unearthed, for a price that would have taken half the colony's land in fees, and when the association refused him, he dropped the smile and filed his suit, and the settlers of Vesterheim learned the particular helplessness of honest people caught in a crooked man's paper. It was a lawyer's raid of a kind that hit many an immigrant colony in those years, for men like Pryor made careers of the gap between what newcomers had earned and what they could prove. And the heart of Pryor's plan, the part that made it wicked rather than merely sharp, was the associations fund. He knew of it, as everyone did. He had arranged, through a friendly county court, to have the association's assets attached, frozen and seized into the court's custody while the suit dragged on, which would leave the colony unable to pay lawyers or refile claims or do anything at all but watch its land go. With the fund in his court's hands, the colony was helpless, and the colony knew it, and despair came down on Vesterheim like an early winter. Lars Holm did not despair. Lars Holm looked at the attachment order coming up the river with the marshal, and at the strong boxes in his keeping that held every family's crossing money and savings and hope, and he did the thing that made him, depending on who told the story afterward, either a thief or a hero. And for 40 years the town had never been sure which. The night before the marshal came, the strong boxes of the Vesterheim Settlement Association vanished. And Lars Holm's boat, the Norland, which had been laid up that season for repairs, went missing from her moorings the same night and was found, days later, run hard aground on Cottonwood Island in the spring flood. Holed, it was said, and ruined. A wreck. And Lars Holm told the marshal and the court and Marcus Pryor's lawyers under oath, the plain truth as he framed it, that the association's funds had been aboard the Norland for safekeeping, and that the boat was lost. And the funds were lost with her, gone into the river, and no man could attach what the river had taken. Pryor's suit collapsed within the year. It collapsed because it had always depended on the seized fund, on the colony being strangled while the case dragged, with nothing to seize. With the colony poor but unstrangled, the settlers found their feet, and the state's own land office, prodded by the colony's honest desperation, reviewed the filings and cured the defects, and Pryor's manufactured claim fell apart. And he left that country with nothing, though his kind never leaves with less than something, and the Pryor name went on to modest respectability elsewhere. The land was saved. The colony survived. But the fund never came back. That was the wound and the mystery, and the thing that had shadowed the home name for 40 years. For the colony had always half believed, and less than half said, that the sinking was no accident, that Lars Holm had hidden the fund to save it from Pryor's court, and the colony had waited, after the suit collapsed, for the treasurer to produce the miracle, to bring the ark home. And Lars Holm had not produced it. He had died. The winter after the suit collapsed, the fever that came up the valley took him in a week, took him with terrible suddenness in the midst of the colony's first safe season, and whatever he knew, whatever he had done and meant to undo, went with him. No funds were ever found. The wrecked Norland was searched, of course, torn through by honest men and greedy ones alike, and she was empty, her holds bare, her cabins stripped, nothing aboard but river mud and ruin. And the colony had buried its treasurer with honor and doubt in equal measure, and the families had absorbed their loss and gone on. For immigrant colonies are made of people who know how to absorb loss and go on, and across 40 years the story of the vanished fund had settled into the town's foundations as its one great unhealed question, and the Holm family had lived under it, the kin of the man who had either saved the colony or robbed it, no one could ever say which, and the not knowing had pressed them slowly down into poverty and apartness, until the last of them was a girl of 19, orphaned that spring, kept through the summer by a stepfather who wanted her gone, and cast out at last in the fall, with winter already wetting its edge on the north wind. Sigrid Holm had 3 things from her family: her great-grandfather's name, and its shadow, a box of his boatwright's tools, kept and handed down because a craftsman's tools are never sold, and one sentence, passed down from Lars's deathbed through 3 generations of Holmes, a sentence the fevered man had said over and over at the end, in Norwegian, gripping the hands around him, "The Norland keeps what the river never got." Her own road to the cold morning of this story had been the road such shadows make. Her grandfather had grown up the doubted treasurer's son, and been kept at the town's edge all his life, her mother had married out of the name and been widowed back into it, and had raised Sigrid alone and poor, cleaning the houses of Vesterheim's comfortable, and had died that spring, worn through at 40, leaving Sigrid to a stepfather who had married a housekeeper and found himself, when she died, saddled with the housekeeper's daughter. He kept her the summer for the work in her, and when the harvest was in and the work grew light and the girl at his table was only a cost, he told her, on a gray morning with the first snow in the wind, that she was grown and the house was small, and gave her $4 for decency's sake, and stood in the doorway while she packed her carpetbag, and did not offer to drive her to town. The family had puzzled over Lars's sentence and grieved over it, and finally filed it away as fever talk, for the Norland had been searched empty a dozen times. But the sentence had been kept, the way families keep the last words of their dead, and it had come down to Sigrid with the tools, and on the day her stepfather turned her out, Sigrid Holmes stood in the road in the cold wind and thought, with the cold clarity of a person with nothing left, the wreck is shelter, and shelter is worth $3, and if I must winter like a rat in a hulk, let it be my family's hulk. And beneath that thought, quiet as a seed under snow, lay the sentence, the Norland keeps what the river never got. She bought the wreck and the island scrap it sat on from the county for $3, and she poled herself over on a borrowed skiff with her carpetbag and her great-grandfather's tools, and she climbed aboard the boat her great-grandfather had built, the first home to stand on her decks in 40 years, and she set about the business of not dying in the winter, which is a business that concentrates the mind wonderfully. She made her camp in the old Texas cabin, highest and soundest part of the boat, and she spent the freezing weeks of early winter making the Norland livable. And it was in that work, the patching and the caulking and the stopping of drafts, that the boat began to speak to her. It was a hard wintering, and she would not afterward pretend otherwise. She had $4 less $3, a carpetbag of clothes, a box of tools, and a hulk on an island with the ice closing in, and the business of staying alive took the whole of every short day. She stopped the Texas cabin's drafts with mud and moss and rags, and rigged the little stove she had salvaged from the wreck's galley, and laid in driftwood against the freeze, sawing and splitting through the gray afternoons until her hands bled and hardened. She fished through the young ice and snared rabbits in the island willows and walked the frozen margins for whatever the river left, and learned the deep old arithmetic of winter poverty, which is that warmth and food are the same sum figured 2 ways, and that both are bought with work and nothing else. There were nights the wind came down the river valley like a scythe, and the old boat groaned and worked around her in the dark, and she lay in her nest of blankets by the stove listening to the timbers her great-grandfather had joined talking to each other under the storm. And she was, strange as she knew it to be, not afraid. The Norland had been built by hands whose blood was her blood, and she could feel, all around her in the dark, how well it had been built, how the old boat still stood square and bore the wind and kept her, and she came to trust the wreck as she had trusted nothing since her mother died, and to talk to it, a little, as one does alone. "Keep me through," she would say to it, "and I will set you right in the spring." Neither of them knew, yet, how much the other was keeping. For Sigrid Holm was a boatwright's great-granddaughter with the boatwright's tools in her hands, and though no one had formally taught her, she had grown up on the family's boat lore the way other children grow up on scripture. And as she worked her way through the old hall, learning her, she began to see the Norland not as a town sees a landmark, but as a builder sees a built thing, and the built thing was strange. The strangeness was this: the Norland was too sound. A boat holed and wrecked in a flood, 40 years exposed, should be broken-backed and rotten through, and above the old waterline the Norland was indeed weathered gray and worn. But her bottom was tight. Sigrid, crawling the lower hull with a lantern in the bitter cold, tapping and probing with her great-grandfather's tools, found the lower hold's planking sound, the frames true, the boat sitting square on her bottom on the island's high ground like a vessel laid up on purpose. And she found no hull. She went at the question the way her family's lore had taught her a boat is read, from the keel up, on her back in the crawling dark with the lantern, working the hull foot by foot with a mallet and her ears. Sound planking answers a mallet one way and wrought another, and seam by seam, frame by frame, through the cold short days after the freeze shut down her outdoor work. Sigrid sounded her great-grandfather's boat, and the boat answered true, 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 all down her bottom 40 years of weather and not a soft frame in her, because Lars Holm had built her of white oak with a master's hand, and the island's high dry ground had kept her. And the more the hull answered true, the louder grew the question underneath the answers. Where is the hull? A whole town's history said the Norland was holed and wrecked. Sigrid crawled every foot of her bottom twice, and there was no hole, no patch, no scar of one. And a boat that was never holed is a boat that was never wrecked. And a boat that was never wrecked, lying 40 years in the exact posture of a vessel laid up carefully on high ground, is not a disaster. It is a decision. Somebody put the Norland here, gently, on purpose, and then told the world she was a wreck. And there was only one somebody it could have been, and Sigrid Holm crawled on down the dark of the hold with her heart beginning to pound, looking now not for damage, but for design. For whatever it was, her great-grandfather had laid this boat down so carefully to protect. And when she came at last, in her crawling, to the after bulkhead of the lower hold, to the sealed section beneath the stern that the old searchers had found planked over and empty behind, she found the seams. Tar. Every seam of that after section, every joint of plank and frame around it, paid over thick with tar, old and hard as stone now, but laid on, once, with enormous care, a full and deliberate sealing. And Sigrid Holm hung her lantern on a frame and knelt in the freezing dark of her great-grandfather's boat and looked at those tarred seams a long time, running her cold fingers along the hardened black lines of a dead man's most careful work, because she could read what the town's searchers, 40 years before, had not been able to read. A repair is tarred from outside. You pay a leaking seam where the water comes in. This tar was on the inside faces, worked into the joints from within the hold, which no repair on earth is ever done. For inside tar keeps nothing out. Inside tar keeps something in, or keeps water away from something. A man tars the inside of a hull section for one reason only, because he is making a box of it. A waterproof box. A vault. And a man makes a waterproof vault in the bottom of a boat when he intends that boat, and everything in that section, to go into the river and come out again unharmed. And the whole 40-year mystery came apart in her hands, like a knot finally pulled from the right end. Lars Holm had never holed his boat. He had beached her, deliberately, high on the island in the spring flood, run her up carefully where the falling water would leave her dry and safe, and he had made it look like wreck. And before ever he sailed her that last night, he had built into her bottom, with his own master hands, a sealed and hidden and waterproof chamber. And the association's strongboxes were not lost in the river, had never been in the river, had never left the boat. They were beneath her, in the tarred vault, under the false floor of the afterhold, where the searchers had found only bare planking, because the searchers were farmers and shopkeepers looking for boxes in rooms, and the boxes were not in a room. They were in the boat's own body, between her floors and her bottom, in a space that did not exist unless you knew how the Norland had been built, and only one man alive had known how the Norland was built, because he had built her. Lars Holm had told the court the exact truth. As an honest man under oath must, the funds were aboard the Norland, and no man could attach them, and the river, indeed, never got them. The Norland keeps what the river never got. It was not fever talk. It was a treasurer's last report, filed with his family, waiting 40 years for a home who could read a hull. She opened it on the coldest day of that winter, with the river iced from bank to bank and the wind screaming over the island, working by lantern light in the hold with her great-grandfather's own tools, and she did it as he would have, with care, cutting the false floor along its hidden joints, rather than smashing it, respecting the work. Even the finding of the joints was a boatwright's examination, set for her by a master, and she felt him testing her as she worked. The false floor of the afterhold had been fitted so cunningly that the searchers of 40 years, standing on it, had taken it for the boat's true bottom. Its joints were disguised in the natural lines of the planking, caulked and paid like working seams, invisible to any eye that did not know that a hull's floors have a geometry, and that this floor sat a foot too high in the boat's body for the geometry to be true. Sigrid knew the geometry, from the lore and the tools and the blood, and she measured the boat inside and out with a cord, as she had once heard her grandmother describe her own father doing, and the measurements said what measurements had said to another woman in another story in another town: there is space here unaccounted for. A foot of hidden depth, running the width of the stern. She found the concealed joints by lantern light, one careful hour at a time, and she set her great-grandfather's thin chisels into seams his hands had closed, and worked them as gently as if the old man stood watching. And the false floor came up in its sections, sweet and true. The way well-made work comes apart for someone who understands it. And beneath the false floor, in the tarred chamber, dry as the day they were sealed, kept perfect through 40 years and 40 floods by a master boatwright's last and greatest piece of craft, were the strong boxes of the Vesterheim Settlement Association, every one, and with them, wrapped in oilskin, the association's books in Lars Holm's careful treasurer's hand, the ledger of every family's contribution, every dollar of crossing money and savings, who had paid in what, down to the widow's small sums, all of it recorded, so that the Ark could one day be returned not as a heap of money, but as what it truly was, the kept and accounted trust of 100 families. Sigrid Holmes sat back on her heels in the freezing lantern-lit hold with the open vault before her, and for a long while she could not move at all. The wind screamed over the island, and the old boat stood square in it, keeping her, as it had kept this. And she looked at the ranked strong-boxes and the oilskin books, and she understood that she was looking at the answer to her family's whole shadowed life, the vindication of a name she had carried like a weight since before she understood what a name was. And she put her face in her cold hands and wept, there in the hold, for her great-grandfather, and for all the doubted homes between him and her, and for herself, cast out before winter into the one shelter in the world that had been waiting 40 years, patient as tar and oak, for a home to come home and be kept. And with the books was a letter. It was addressed, in Norwegian, to the association, and it was Lars Holm's account, written in the days between the beaching and the fever, of exactly what he had done and why, that he had hidden the fund from Prior's court because the court was the swindle's instrument, that he had meant to raise the boxes the moment the suit was dead and the danger past, that he begged the association's pardon for the deception and stood ready to answer for it. He had written it, plainly, to be read within the year. He had not imagined the fever. He had made a vault that could defeat the river, the court, and 40 years, and it had defeated his own colony's need too, for want of the one thing he could not seal into it, which was time. Sigrid Holm wintered aboard the Norland with the recovered ark of her colony beneath her feet, and she told no one until the ice went out. For a girl alone on an island with a fortune has good reason to wait for the law's own season, and when the river opened, she crossed to Vesterheim, and went quietly to the association, for the Vesterheim Settlement Association still existed, gone gray and ceremonial, a burial society and a memory now, but chartered still, its old books still in a trunk in the church basement. And she laid before the association's astonished elders her great-grandfather's letter, and his ledger, and the news that the Ark of Vesterheim was found. What followed that spring was the settling of a 40-year account, and it was done as Lars Holm had prepared it to be done, family by family, out of his own ledger. The strongboxes were raised and opened lawfully before the elders in the county, and the fund was there entire, and the ledger parceled it out to its owners, to the descendants of every family that had paid in. The crossing money and the savings of their grandparents returned with the treasurer's accounting, 40 years late and to the penny. There were families in Vesterheim that spring who received back, from the hands of a 19-year-old girl, the exact recorded sums their grandmothers had entrusted to Lars Holm, and there was weeping in the old church when the ledger was read aloud. Name after name, the whole roll of the colony's founders, their trust kept and honored across 40 years by a dead man's craft and a living girl's cold winter. And the Holm name came out of its shadow, all at once and forever. For the letter and the ledger and the vault itself told the town what 40 years of doubt had withheld, that Lars Holm had been, all along, exactly what the colony had first believed him, the steadiest and most faithful man in Vesterheim, who had saved the Ark from the swindler's court with the finest trick of his craft, and had died before he could complete the salvation, and had trusted his own blood, down the generations, to finish it. He had not robbed the colony. He had outbuilt it, outthought its enemies, and kept its whole hope dry through 40 floods. The town gave him, that summer, the finest thing it had to give. They raised his name onto the founder's stone by the church, where it had 40 years been conspicuously absent, and the pastor preached on the faithful steward. And old women who had grown up hearing the Holmes doubted stopped Sigrid in the street to press her hands. Sigrid Holm was not left poor, for the association, in its last great act before it dissolved its charter with honor complete, voted her the finder's share that law and gratitude alike demanded, and it was ample. But what Sigrid did with her share told the town whose blood she was. She rebuilt the Norland. Not to steam again, for her working days were done, but sound and dry and honest. The boat her great-grandfather built raised up from a shunned hulk into the pride of the riverfront, moored fast off Vesterheim landing, and within her, in the very hold that had kept the Ark, Sigrid made a hall for the town, where the association's old books and Lars Holm's letter and the famous tarred vault itself, opened and lit, could be seen by anyone, so that the story of the treasurer who kept faith would be told as long as the town stood. And Sigrid Holm lived aboard, the keeper of the Norland, and in time the keeper became a boatwright in earnest, the river's only woman in the trade, mending and building for the whole reach with her great-grandfather's tools, and no one on that river ever again said the name Holm with anything but respect. She had been 19 years old, and cast out before winter with $4 and a carpetbag and nowhere in the world to go, and she had spent 3 of the 4 on a rotting wreck that a whole town swore was searched empty 40 years ago. Because a wreck with a roof is still a roof. And because her family's last words had told her, if only she could hear them rightly, exactly where to spend it. It was the best $3 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the recovered fund, though the fund was 100 families' justice. It is that faithfulness does not expire. Lars Holm was given a trust, and he kept it against a swindler, against a court, against the river itself, and when death interrupted the keeping, his faithfulness simply waited, sealed in tar in the dark, unexpired, for 40 years, until it could be completed by another pair of Holm hands. The town doubted him for 2 generations, and the doubt could not touch him. Because faithfulness that is real does not depend on being believed in, it only depends on being finished. And it was finished. Somewhere in your own family, too, there may be a trust half kept, a faithfulness interrupted, waiting quietly for the one who will complete it. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Was there ever someone in your family's story who was doubted for years, and turned out in the end to have been keeping faith all along? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.